Don't bury her. She's still warm." The words were a shard of ice in the frozen air, sharp and desperate. They came from a young woman kneeling in the snow, her thin, light blue prairie dress a fragile splash of color against the vast, unforgiving white. Her hands, red with cold, hovered over the still form of another woman, her twin, dressed in pale green. Jacob saw them from the ridge, two impossible figures in the desolate expanse of his land. He had lived alone for 20 years, and the silence of the winter landscape was a language he understood. This sound, this raw, piercing grief, was an intrusion. He urged his horse forward, the crunch of snow under its hooves the only reply to the woman's plea. As he drew closer, he saw the scene in stark detail. The woman in blue, her face streaked with tears that had frozen on her cheeks, was looking at him, her eyes pleading. The woman in green lay perfectly still, a dusting of snow on her dark hair. There was no rise and fall of her chest, no visible breath misting in the frigid air. "Please," the kneeling woman whispered as he dismounted. "They want to take her. They say she is gone." Jacob's gaze swept the horizon. There were no other tracks but their own, a desperate, stumbling line that ended here. "There's no one else here," he said, his voice a low rumble, unused to speech. "They will come," she insisted, her entire body trembling. "They will say she is cold, but she is not. Feel." She gestured to her sister's neck. Jacob hesitated. He was an old man, and this was a sorrow he did not want to touch. But her desperation was a physical force pulling him in. He knelt, his knees cracking in protest, and removed his thick leather glove. He pressed his fingers against the pale skin of the woman on the ground. He expected the deep, unyielding cold of death. He found the opposite. A strange, vibrant warmth radiated from her, a living heat that felt more like a banked fire than fading life. It was unnatural. He checked for a pulse. Nothing. He leaned close, listening for a breath. Silence. Yet the warmth was undeniable, a profound, inexplicable fact in the face of every sign of death. He looked at the living sister. Her eyes held his, a silent, frantic question. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Anne," she said. "And her?" He motioned to the still form. "Leanne." He stood up, his mind grappling with the impossibility. The snow was falling harder now, the world shrinking to just the three of them. Bury her? No, this was not death as he knew it. This was something else. "Get up," he said to Anne. "We're going to my home. I'm not leaving you two out here." Anne's shoulders slumped in relief, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. She looked down at her sister, her protector. "She is so heavy," she whispered, her hope flickering. Jacob simply nodded, bent down, and gathered the strangely warm body of Leanne into his arms. She was light, too light, but the heat she gave off was like holding a stone that had been left by a fire. He carried Leanne back to the small, sturdy cabin he called home, a dark shape against the snow-swept plains. Anne followed close behind, her steps unsteady, clutching a small, worn leather satchel to her chest as if it held the last of her strength. The wind howled, trying to tear the warmth from his arms, but Leanne's body remained a stubborn furnace against his chest. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of pine smoke and solitude. A low fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn wooden walls. He laid Leanne gently on his own cot, the only soft place in the entire cabin. He covered her with a thick wool blanket, though the gesture felt absurd given the heat she was producing. Anne stood by the door, a ghost in a pale blue dress, her dark eyes tracking his every move. She watched as he lit another lamp, the small room filling with a warmer, steadier light. He turned to face her, truly seeing her now. She was young, no more than 20, and fear had carved sharp lines into her face. But beneath the fear, There was a core of something hard and unyielding. "You need to get warm," he said, gesturing to the fire. She didn't move. Her gaze was fixed on her sister. Jacob walked over to the cot and began his own examination. He was no doctor, but he knew life and he knew death. Leanne was a contradiction. Her skin was supple, her limbs not yet stiff, but there was no discernible sign of life. No flicker of an eyelid, no breath, no heartbeat he could find. Yet the warmth persisted, a dry, penetrating heat that seemed to emanate from her very bones. He pulled back the blanket and placed his hand on her chest. The warmth was strongest there, a concentrated core of impossible energy. "What happened to her?" he asked quietly, not looking away from Leanne. Anne finally moved, drifting closer to the fire, but her eyes never left her sister. She shivered, not from the cold outside, but from a tremor deep within. "He did this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who?" Anne shook her head, her hand tightening on the strap of her satchel. "A bad man. A man who collects beautiful things." The words hung in the air, cryptic and heavy with unspoken history. Jacob understood then that he had not just brought two women in from the cold, he had brought their trouble in with them. The silence in the cabin deepened, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the moan of the wind outside. He looked from the impossibly warm, still body of Leanne to the fierce, terrified eyes of Anne. He had lived a life of quiet isolation, deliberately keeping the world and its complications at a distance. That world had just kicked his door in. He pulled a chair over to the cot and sat down, a silent sentinel. "He will not find you here," he said, making a promise he had no idea if he could keep. Anne finally looked at him, and for the first time a single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. It was not a tear of grief, but of fragile, exhausted gratitude. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a pale winter sun. The blizzard passed, leaving behind a world of pristine, silent white. The isolation of the ranch, once a comfort to Jacob, now felt like a vulnerability. He was alone with this impossible situation. He had ridden the 10 miles to the dusty settlement that passed for a town, its single street a muddy track between false-fronted buildings. He sought out the doctor, a man named Harris, whose hands smelled perpetually of whiskey and regret. Jacob explained the situation as best he could, the lack of pulse, the absence of breath, the inexplicable radiating warmth. Harris had listened with a cynical, weary expression, then shook his head. "Sounds like she's gone, Jacob. The warmth? Shot, maybe. The body does strange things." "It's been 3 days," Jacob insisted. "The warmth hasn't faded. It's constant." "I'm not riding 10 miles into the snow for a ghost story," the doctor had said, turning back to his drink. "When she gets cold, you bury her. That's the way of it." Jacob returned to the cabin with a few supplies and a heavy sense of foreboding. He was truly on his own. During his absence, Anne had not been idle. She had cleaned the small cabin with a quiet efficiency, her movements deft and purposeful. She had opened her small leather satchel on the table, revealing neat bundles of dried herbs and roots, their faint, earthy scent filling the room. She was tending to Leanne, wiping her face with a damp cloth, whispering to her in a language that flowed like water. On the 4th day, she finally began to speak of what had happened, her English hesitant, but imbued with a desperate clarity. "Leanne has a gift," she began, her hands busy crushing herbs in a small stone bowl. "A warmth, not just of the body. She can soothe pain, mend what is broken. When she touches someone who is hurting, the warmth flows from her into them." She explained they had come from a distant land, following the promise of a new life, only to find hardship. They had made their way by using Leanne's gift, helping people in small, hidden communities, but such things do not stay hidden. "A man heard of her," Anne continued, her voice dropping low. His name is Finch. He doesn't see a person. He sees a marvel, a thing to be owned. Finch, she explained, had pursued them for months. He offered them riches, a life of ease, but his eyes were cold and possessive. He wanted to put Leanne on display, to sell her warmth to wealthy, ailing patrons. When they refused, he became relentless. He found us 2 weeks ago. He did not use a gun. He used this. She held up a small, dark vial. A poison from a rare flower. It does not kill. It pauses. It stops the heart, the lungs, but it traps the warmth. It turns her into a living furnace, a relic he can transport and sell. He wanted her still, easier to control. The revelation settled in the room, more chilling than the winter air outside. Leanne was not sick. She was a prisoner in her own body, and Finch had not given up. "He is coming for her," Anne whispered, her eyes wide with a terror that was now starkly understandable. "He knows where we ran. He will not stop." The stakes had changed completely. This was no longer a fight against a mysterious ailment. It was a fight against a man. The world outside the cabin remained a blank canvas of white for 2 more days. Then, on the 7th morning, a shape appeared on the horizon. It was small at first, a dark speck against the blinding snow, but it moved with a steady, inexorable purpose. It was not a rider on horseback. It was a man on foot, walking as if the 10 miles of brutal, frozen landscape were a stroll through a city park. Jacob watched him from the window, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. Anne stood behind him, her breath fogging the glass. She didn't need to ask. She knew. The man, Finch, drew closer. He was dressed in a long, dark wool coat, impeccably tailored, and a fine hat that seemed to defy the wind. He carried no visible weapon, only a silver-tipped walking cane that he used not for support, but to idly tap against the frozen ground. He moved with an eerie, unhurried grace, his presence a violation of the raw, untamed wilderness. He was a creature of parlors and contracts, and he looked utterly, terrifyingly out of place. As he approached the small clearing in front of the cabin, the wind, which had been a constant, mournful presence, seemed to die down. The air grew still. The silence became heavy, expectant. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. He stopped about 30 yards from the front door, his gaze sweeping over the simple cabin, the thin plume of smoke rising from the chimney, the weathered wood of the porch. His expression was one of mild disdain, as if he were assessing a particularly shabby piece of property he was obliged to acquire. He did not shout or call out. He simply waited, a figure of calm, predatory patience. His stillness was more menacing than any threat. He was not a raider coming to take by force. He was a collector coming to claim what he already believed was his. Jacob felt Anne's hand grip his arm, her knuckles white. He could feel the tremor running through her. He looked down at his own hands, calloused and worn from a lifetime of hard labor. They seemed impossibly fragile against the cold, calculated threat standing in his yard. The distant sky was a sheet of bruised purple and gray, the promise of another storm gathering in the west. It was a perfect mirror for the storm that was about to break right here on his doorstep. Jacob took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. He had never asked for this fight, but it had come to him. He opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the porch, the cold hitting him like a physical blow. The 2 men faced each other across the silent, snow-covered ground. Finch smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of his lips that held no warmth. "I believe you have something of mine," he said, his voice calm and cultured, carrying easily in the still air. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Jacob stood on the porch, his feet planted, his worn coat pulled tight against the cold. He said nothing. His silence was a wall. Finch's smile tightened. "I am a reasonable man. I am prepared to offer you a significant sum for your troubles. $500. A fortune for a man in your position. Enough to ensure you live out your remaining years in comfort." He spoke of Jacob's life as if it were a ledger to be settled, a minor account to be closed. He did not glance at the cabin, did not acknowledge the human being inside. He was discussing a transaction. "She is not for sale," Jacob said. The words were quiet, but they were absolute, like stones dropping into a deep well. Finch's composure flickered for the first time. A flash of irritation crossed his features. "You misunderstand," he said, his tone sharpening. "This is not a negotiation. That is my property in your house, a valuable, unique asset. You are merely an obstacle, a temporary inconvenience." He took a step forward, tapping his cane on the ground. "I have men positioned on the ridge. They have rifles. The town? The sheriff has been paid for his discretion. The good people of that dreary settlement have been reminded that it is unwise to involve themselves in the affairs of their betters. You are alone, old man." From inside the cabin there was a metallic scrape. A Noon appeared in the doorway behind Jacob. In her hands she held the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. Her arms trembled from its weight, her knuckles were white, but her grip was firm. Her face was a mask of terrified defiance. She would not hide. Finch's eyes flickered towards her, a dismissive, contemptuous glance. The sister, sentimental, but ultimately irrelevant. He turned his attention back to Jacob. "I will ask you one last time. Step aside. Take the money, or I will have my men remove you. The outcome will be the same. The only variable is your continued existence." The air grew colder, the silence more profound. This was the moment. Jacob could feel the weight of his years, the ache in his bones. He could also feel the warmth of Anne's presence behind him, a small, fierce flame of courage. He thought of the woman lying on his cot, a prisoner of a terrible magic, her life's warmth stolen and commodified. He looked at Finch, at his fine coat and his cold, empty eyes. "You'll have to come through me," Jacob said. It wasn't a heroic declaration. It was a simple statement of fact, a line drawn in the snow. Finch let out a sigh, a sound of theatrical disappointment. "So be it." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of his head. On the low ridge behind him, two figures rose from the snow, long rifles in their hands. They did not aim at Jacob, not yet. Their presence was enough. It was a show of force, a final, brutal argument. But something else was happening. Over the rise behind the cabin, another group of figures appeared. Not men with rifles, but the townspeople. They walked slowly, hesitantly, drawn by the unfolding drama. There was the blacksmith, wiping his hands on his leather apron, the store owner and his wife, a few ranch hands from neighboring properties. They stopped at a distance, a scattered, uncertain audience, their faces pinched by the cold and by indecision. They were the morally ambiguous crowd, the silent witnesses who could tip the balance with their action or their apathy. Finch saw them, and his lips curled into another cold smile. He turned to address them, his voice projecting easily, filled with condescending authority. "Go back to your homes," he called out. "This is a private matter, a business dispute. This old man is interfering with the recovery of my legal property. It does not concern you." Some of the townspeople shuffled their feet, their eyes darting from Finch to Jacob, then to the armed men on the ridge. Fear and uncertainty were plain on their faces. They had their own lives, their own hardships. This was not their fight. Jacob knew he could not win with force. He had only one weapon, the truth. He looked past Finch, his gaze settling on the faces in the crowd. He recognized them. He had traded with them, shared a rare drink with them, endured the same harsh winters alongside them. He did not raise his voice. He spoke to them as a neighbor. "You all know me," he said, his voice steady. "I've lived here for 20 years. I keep to myself. I don't ask for trouble, and I don't cause it." He paused, letting his words settle. "This man wants the young woman in my house, not because she has done wrong, not because she owes him a debt, but because he wants to own her, to use her. He believes that his money gives him the right to turn a person into a thing." He gestured toward Leanne inside the cabin. "She is helpless. Her sister is terrified. Is that the world we want to live in? One where the strong can just take from the weak? Where a stranger with a fat purse can come here and decide who is a person and who is property?" His words were simple. They were not a call to arms. They were a question of conscience, and it hung in the frigid air, demanding an answer. Just as the crowd's uncertainty threatened to curdle back into fear, the cabin door opened wider. Anne stepped out onto the porch, moving past Jacob to stand at the edge of the steps. The iron poker was still in her hand, but her focus was no longer on Finch. It was on the people of the town. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and resonant with a pain that was impossible to ignore. "He speaks of property," she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength with every word. "Let me tell you of this property. My sister Leanne has a gift of healing. She can ease the pain of a fevered child, soothe the ache in an old woman's joints. She has only ever used this gift to help. We have asked for nothing but a safe place to live." Her eyes scanned the faces, pleading for understanding. "This man, Finch, he does not want to be healed. He wants to own the cure. He poisoned my sister. He stopped her heart so he could carry her around like a warm stone, to sell pieces of her warmth to rich men who are cold inside." She held up the small leather satchel she had carried so carefully. "This is all we have. Herbs for remedies. Knowledge passed down from our mother. We are healers. We are not things." Her emotional plea, so raw and genuine, was a stark contrast to Finch's cold, transactional language. It humanized the conflict in a way Jacob's quiet defiance could not. A woman at the front of the crowd, the store owner's wife, took a half step forward. Her husband put a hand on her arm, but she shook it off. Her face was set with a new resolve. Then the blacksmith, a large, quiet man, took a deliberate step forward, planting his feet firmly in the snow. He wasn't armed, but his presence was a statement. One by one, others followed. A small shift became a movement. They were no longer a scattered audience. They were forming a line, a loose, human barrier between Finch and the cabin. They shuffled and murmured, but they did not retreat. They were choosing a side. The wind, which had been still for so long, began to rise again. It whipped at their clothes and swirled fine crystals of snow into the air, a physical manifestation of the changing tide. Finch watched this transformation, his face contorting from confident disdain into a mask of disbelief and fury. He had bought their silence, but he had not bought their souls. Finch's face was pale with rage. He had lost control. His authority, built on a foundation of money and intimidation, was crumbling before his eyes. "Fools," he hissed, his voice losing its polished calm. "You have no idea what you are doing." He turned to his men on the ridge and gave a sharp, angry signal, a flick of his wrist. "Clear them out!" The two riflemen hesitated. They had been hired to intimidate a lone old man, not to confront an entire town. They looked down at the determined faces of the blacksmith, the ranchers, the women, their neighbors. They saw not a mob, but a community. As the rifleman wavered, another figure pushed his way through the crowd. It was the sheriff, a man named Cutler who had a reputation for valuing his own comfort above all else. He had been lingering at the back, content to let events unfold as long as he wasn't involved. But he could no longer remain a passive observer. The town had made its choice, and he knew he had to choose with them or become an outcast. He walked until he was standing beside Jacob, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, not drawing it, but making his allegiance clear. "Finch," the sheriff said, his voice flat and official, "this has gone far enough. These people are under my protection. Your business here is concluded." Finch stared at him, aghast. "I paid you, Cutler. I paid you to look the other way." "And I'm giving you your money back," the sheriff replied, his gaze unwavering. "Now get off this land." The standoff was over. No shots had been fired. No blood had been shed. The confrontation had been won not by bullets, but by a collective act of courage. Finch's power, so absolute just moments before, had evaporated. His men on the ridge, seeing their employer's authority broken and the sheriff now against them, lowered their rifles and began a slow retreat. Finch was truly alone now, surrounded by the silent condemnation of the very people he had dismissed. He spat on the snow-covered ground, a final, impotent gesture of contempt. "You will all regret this," he snarled, his eyes promising a future retribution he no longer had the power to enact. He turned and walked away, his proud, confident stride now a stiff, furious retreat. The townspeople watched him go until he was just a small, dark speck against the vast white, swallowed by the landscape he had tried to dominate. The wind howled, but it was no longer a mournful sound. It felt like a cleansing breath. The moment Finch disappeared over the horizon, the tension that had held everyone in its grip finally snapped. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the crowd. The blacksmith walked onto the porch and clapped a heavy hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You did the right thing, Jacob," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. The store owner's wife approached Anne, her expression full of a sympathy that needed no words. She gently took the iron poker from Anne's trembling hands and led her back into the warmth of the cabin. People began to talk, their voices low at first, then rising with a sense of shared purpose. They had faced down a tyrant, not with weapons, but with simple, unified decency, and the act had changed them. They were no longer just a collection of individuals surviving near each other. They were a community. Someone was sent to fetch the doctor, and this time there was no refusal. Shamed by the town's collective action, Harris arrived an hour later, his medical bag in hand. He entered the cabin, his usual cynicism replaced by a grudging respect. He examined Leanne, his brow furrowed in complete bafflement. He listened to her chest with his stethoscope, shook his head, and felt the steady, unnatural warmth. "I've never seen anything like it," he admitted, looking at Anne. "Whatever that man gave her, it's beyond my knowledge." He looked at the herbs and remedies spread on the table. "You may know more about this than I do. What does she need?" Anne, no longer seeing a threat but a potential ally, began to explain. She pointed to specific herbs, one to counteract the poison's paralytic effect, another to soothe the body's taxed energy, a third to gently coax the spirit back. The doctor listened, nodding slowly, his medical training giving way to the quiet authority of Anne's ancient knowledge. He helped her prepare the poultices and infusions, his practiced hands grinding herbs alongside hers. Outside, the townspeople did not disperse. They brought blankets, firewood, and pots of hot stew. They stood a quiet vigil, their presence a protective circle around the small cabin. Jacob sat in his chair by the fire watching this quiet miracle unfold. His solitary world had been breached, filled with the noise and warmth of human connection. He looked at Leanne, her face peaceful on the cot, and at Anne, working with a focused intensity, a healer claiming back her sister from the brink. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, but it was only snow, a soft, thick blanket that covered the land, burying the tracks of the man who had brought so much darkness. Over the next few days, the cabin became a place of quiet, hopeful work. Anne barely slept, constantly administering her remedies, whispering to Leanne, holding her hand, willing her to return. The warmth in Leanne's body began to change. It was no longer a feverish, unnatural heat. It softened, becoming a gentle, life-affirming glow. Her pale skin regained a touch of color. The rigid stillness of her limbs relaxed. Jacob and the rest of the town supported them in every way they could. They kept the fire roaring, ensured there was always fresh water and hot food, and stood guard, though no one believed Finch would dare to return. The shared crisis had forged a bond between the sisters and the community. They were no longer strange, foreign outsiders. They were theirs to protect. On the third morning after the confrontation, as a sliver of dawn light pierced the cabin window, Anne was sitting by the cot, exhausted, her head resting on the edge of the mattress. A faint movement made her look up. Leanne's eyelids were fluttering. Anne's breath caught in her throat. She leaned closer, her heart pounding. "Leanne?" she whispered, her voice thick with hope and exhaustion. Leanne's eyes slowly opened. They were unfocused at first, then they found Anne's face. A small, weak smile touched her lips. "Anne," she breathed, her voice a dry rasp. It was the most beautiful sound Anne had ever heard. Tears streamed down Anne's face as she hugged her sister, careful of her weakness. Jacob, woken by the sounds, stood in the corner of the room, a rare smile on his own weathered face. The news spread through the town like a spring thaw. Leanne was awake. The healing had begun. Weeks turned into a month. Leanne's strength slowly returned. The warmth was still a part of her, but it was different now. It was calm, controlled, a gift she could command rather than a condition that imprisoned her. She and Anne were no longer running. The people of the town, having invested their own courage in the sisters' fate, offered them a home. The blacksmith offered them work helping his arthritic wife. The store owner gave them credit. They were woven into the fabric of the community. The harsh winter finally broke, its icy grip yielding to the promise of spring. The snow receded, revealing the dark, rich earth beneath. Jacob sat on his porch, watching the two sisters in the yard. They had cleared a small patch of ground and were planting a garden, their hands in the soil, their faces turned toward the sun. They were home. He knew the world was still a dangerous place, that men like Finch still existed. But here, in this small patch of land, a community had remembered its own strength, and two sisters, once hunted and afraid, could finally put down roots.